Finally. Been supporting a missionary for years and you've never seen him, some of you. Who is this guy? Well, we'll try to give you as much info today as we can. When is my termination time? 10:40. Okay. All right. Yeah, I can see that. I'm going to use Sunday school. I'm going to give you my life verse, and I'm going to turn there so that if I wanted to use any other scriptures, any of them comes along the way out of the book of Philippians. Philippians 1:6 I adopted early in my ministry when I came across it in the book of Philippians. Being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it unto the day of Jesus Christ. Word perform, I think you might know that it means he'll complete it. He'll finish it. He'll get the job done no matter what comes your way. As far as introducing you to me for now, I was born at a very young age in Salisbury, North Carolina. That's Salisbury. Salisbury is in South Africa, but we call it Salisbury down there in the Piedmont of North Carolina. And it was November 7, 1946. I'll soon be 77 years old. And you've heard about my son Bradley, and I'll share more about him in a little while, and probably with the rest of the congregation when they come later. He's almost 50 years old. He'll be 50 in about a month. And he had a car wreck helping me in the ministry where he hydroplaned off a mountain. He and some other cars in a big storm. We had tornadic activity, high winds, and a lot of cars were just swept off the road, hydroplane, heavy rain. He went down a mountain, about 40-foot drop where he went, but it was enough to give him a brain bleed. And they didn't know about the brain bleed. They took their time getting him out of the car. It was still raining. And then he started passing out, and they realized then they had something more serious. But by the time they got him to the hospital in the rain, an hour and a half away, 4 hours had elapsed. And the clot was the size of his fist inside his head. And it pushed his brain over to the side and cut into the brain stem. So he lost the left side of his body, paralyzed. He's hemiplegic. He lost the left eye because of the clot being so big it cut off the circulation to the optic nerve in the left eye. So it was dead when he finally woke up. He was comatose for about 3 months altogether, and then it was 3 more months where he was semi-coma, in and out. And it was a long, drawn-out process. He was on machines at our house to stay alive for almost 1 year. And it was about a year until his mouth opened up in the 10th month. But he wasn't able to eat successfully and taste his food till about 2 months later. So it's a long story. I wanted to give you the basics so you'd know why he's not with me. He hasn't traveled with me much in quite a few years. And he doesn't have the stamina that he had. He has seizures regularly. He has started the grand mal seizures again, the very serious ones. So he sleeps probably 18 hours out of 24. And when he has seizures, he may sleep for 24 to 36 hours before he wakes back up. And so we just kind of wait it out. And when he wakes back up, he'll be lethargic for a few days. So taking him on a trip very far, he almost always has a seizure. He often has them after I take him to church because he's so tired that sitting on the pew for an hour, hour and a half, just wears him out. By the time I get him home, I got to get him to bed, give him some medicine, hope he doesn't have a seizure. But if he does, then I have to get someone hired to come in and stay with him so that I can go back and preach that night. I did that while I was pastoring the church before the heart attack. So I really wish he could be with me. He came to Camp Maranatha for many years, even though he was paralyzed, because then he was manageable, but no longer. He's got severe deterioration now. They did an MRI right before I left. They think he may have a tumor or swelling of the brain that's causing him to change personality. He's become very angry, and he's violent to himself and others. And we're trying to determine if there's a medical cause for that. So anyhow, the caregivers that are with him, though, the lady's been working with us for 14 years. And the husband comes and stays at night with her there at the house. We're living in the church parsonage, the church that I pastored on 2 occasions, and the church I was pastoring when I had the heart attack. But they've allowed us to stay in the parsonage because it's in kind of a semi-rough neighborhood, and they didn't want to leave the house empty. So they thought it'd be better for us to stay there, and be better for the house to have someone in it, because houses deteriorate pretty fast. The new pastor doesn't need the house. He's a Cherokee Indian, lives on the reservation, has his own place. So it's made it real easy. The house has been fully handicap remodeled for Brad. I have to pause sometimes. The Indian church, I've been there for 23 years, I think, altogether as a member. Pastored at the beginning, and then the door opened to the Philippines, and that opened through the Cherokees. The Filipinos came into Cherokee. The Indians loved them because brown skin, and the Cherokees basically said, we've never seen brown-skinned people so happy and so excited about serving the Lord. And so they started supporting them as missionaries, and they wanted me to go over and check the work out, go over and take a visit, and they took care of expenses. But when I went over there, I wanted to do it full time. In one service, we had about 15, maybe as many as 20 converts of young people in one service, and they were all high school and college age kids. And they came to me after the service and said, I got saved, but I believe God's calling me to preach. And a few of the young boys said that. Where do I go to school? I'd like to go to school, kind of test it out. And so they wanted us to start a school. So in 2002, I helped Brother Victor Carpio found the Lagawi Baptist Bible College. Now we've moved that college to a 5-acre campus an hour away in the major city of Bayambong. The old building is being used for the church there, and a Christian school is what they're starting in that building. So that's going to work out really good. And we've got a new campus that we moved to, I guess, 8 or 10 years ago, 5 acres. And some lawyers that got saved helped us get that property. They found it. They had bought property in that area, and they said, why don't y'all buy 5 acres here, and we're going to retire here, and we can have the youth camp here, and it'll be fun to be right next to the youth camp in our retirement. So they got us a good deal on it, and we bought that property and started building some buildings on it eventually. So we'll do some more of that later, talk more about that. You want me just be all right to circulate some of these pictures and just let them pass them around? They'll at least get to see me and Brad together, and they'll see Brad and I in the Philippines on a mission trip. We went over there for Christmas one year, and boy, it was really, really exciting time. I took him to Romania about 3 or 4 years after his initial injury. He got his eating back. A lot of the paralysis left the left side, and it looked like a palsy drop, over here. And he got his full smile back. He got his taste buds back. He got his eating back. And so I put him on an airplane, and we flew to Romania. And it was a great trip overall. He was strong enough then he could walk up 3 flights of stairs holding on to the rail. Then he broke a leg while I was overseas. He fell at church and broke his leg on the left, and he wasn't able to walk after that. It snapped the femur right at the ball that goes into the hip joint. And he's got a metal contraption in there that lets him stand up on it, but he's not allowed to put much weight on it at all. So that ended his walking time. He had learned to walk about 20 feet with a cane and then lose his balance, and you'd have to hold on to him. But that all ended too. And I will say this, he's been quite a soul winner through the years. He's reached people that I would have never been able to reach. The night of his wreck, there was a 6'7" doctor showed up, and he come in there and he said, Reverend Park, he said, I wanted to let you know that I'm an atheist. And if you don't want me to do surgery on your son, I'll step aside and let someone else. Now, this was midnight. And I said, well, you on call? He said, no, sir. They called me in on this case because it's a young man. And I said, well, why would they call you? And he said, because I'm the best. And they wanted it done right on this young man. And I said, okay, if you're the best, you go ahead and do surgery on my son, and we'll talk about God later. About 3 years later, that atheist got saved. His wife was already a Christian, and she was battling trying to live with him. He was quite a rascal in those early days. But a visit with Brad went back after 2 years to visit him. We had to get a tube removed out of his intestines when he learned to eat. The tube had to come out. We had to go back to that doctor to get it done because he was about the only one who could do it. He put it in, so the other doctor said, let him take it out. He knows how to do it. Anyhow, went back to him, and Brad and I went walking in. Brad with the cane, the doctor saw us. He turned around and went to his office. He finally come in. His eyes were all red. I learned later he went to his office to cry. He'd been telling his wife about this boy that's not going to live. He said, I told his daddy, said he's going to have a miracle. His mouth was locked shut, and that boy's not going to survive without a miracle. And he said, I was real smart, and I told his preacher daddy, said, well, if you want your boy to live, you're going to need a miracle. I said, okay. I just said, we'll work on that. And we hung up the phone. So this was a year or two later, I guess. I don't remember the exact dates that it was, that he went walking in there, smiling and everything, and eating. And the doctor was so shocked that he broke into tears and had a breakdown right there in his office. And we sat waiting on him for 15 or 20 minutes in the exam room. He finally come in there, and he was just totally speechless. No big mouth, no atheist, none of that stuff. Well, then my wife got breast cancer, and it was terminal. But she needed a mastectomy, and I called him up. And I said, you're the best, right? He didn't say nothing. I said, would you do my wife's surgery? He said, yes. Bring her on over tomorrow and we'll get started. We'll get a date set up. And when we arrived at his office, his wife was there waiting on us, the doctor's wife. She come out there, tears in her eyes, went up to Brad, hugged Brad, and said, you're Brad Park. You're the one that won my husband to Christ. She said, Brad, he hasn't been able to hardly sleep a night since you made the office visit a year ago. And said, I want to let you know he got saved. He's teaching the men's Sunday school class at church. He won't go on call on Sunday. He said, don't call me on Sunday. I won't be coming on Sunday. She said, it's wonderful. About that time, the big doctor walks out in the waiting room. He's got 20 people waiting on him out there. And he stops and says, please give me a moment, folks. I'll get to you, but I want to see Brad and talk to the family. And here he comes. I got pictures at home where he got pictures made with him. And that's just one case where the old atheist was flipped over and became a believer because of the influence that God used through Brad. And if you ever ask, why am I going through these tests and trials, there is always a reason, and we may not always know it. I had the privilege of learning and seeing face to face how God used Brad. There's at least a dozen stories similar to this I could tell. One counselor at Camp Maranatha got saved. When Brad rolled up to her in his wheelchair and looked at her and said, "Ma'am, are you sure you're saved?" And she told me later, she said, "I realized I wasn't." And she went to her pastor and said, "I can't counsel anymore this week because I'm not saved." He said, "What?" So she was converted during camp that week and was baptized later. And when Brad and I made a trip to the Philippines, she bought Brad's plane ticket. About $1,500. She sent a check, said, "Here, I want to buy Brad's plane ticket." The young man that won me to Christ. And that I've been able to see through the years. So I'm really blessed to see how God used Brad in his condition. And even now, the doctors are sad because he's getting worse. And he's been their pet patient for all these years, almost 30 years now. Well, maybe I've said too much there, but I've had a few people this morning ask me questions about Brad. When did it start? How did it start? How did he get hurt? And I just felt like it'd be good for you to know where he's been, an overview there. I was born into a Lutheran family. At age 14, I was the head of the Acolyte Guild. They're the boys that light the candles and then snuff them out at the end of the service. I was the head of the guild at 14, so I walked the choir down the aisle holding up a cross on an oak pole, and the choir would follow me in. I had beautiful white robes and all this fancy-looking stuff for this church. Even though we were a country church, we were pretty formal. And then along the way, Daddy died when I was 18. He had a heart attack at age 55 and died at home. And I was left to take care of my mother at 18. I had sort of a semi-nervous breakdown, where you have all these, what do you call them when you, panic attacks. I had 2 years of panic attacks. God revealed to me that I was a sinner during those 2 years. I got to where I was afraid to die. My older brother invited me to his church, and he was going to a little old Baptist church. I went there for a few months and decided I can't handle this. They're shouting and crying and praying, and I hadn't been around this kind of stuff. This is crazy. These Baptists are. But I had to go back. I said that Sunday morning, went back Sunday night. It wasn't long that God spoke to me and saved me sitting in the pew while the pastor preached. Had a good pastor in that little church. He read Spurgeon. And he would take Spurgeon's sermons and kind of make them his own and then preach them. And boy, he had some good ones. I didn't know where he was getting them, but boy, they were good. And I got saved back in 1967 in February. I don't remember the exact date, 22nd or something like that. February of 1967. And God started opening doors a few weeks later for me to go have rest home services, go to the prison with the pastor. And so I started preaching a little bit, and next thing I knew, I got a phone call from the man that owned the radio station in Salisbury. He said, "Son, if I give you 15 minutes free on Sunday morning, would you come and would you keep coming and not quit on me?" I said, "Yes, sir." So I had a free radio broadcast from about 9 to 9:15 every Sunday morning. 20 years old. And wow, it was I just was having a wonderful time. Nursing home 2 or 3 times a week. Go to youth camp all summer. And I thought, boy, this is a wonderful life, this ministry. I didn't know yet what it was going to be to have to be a pastor. Now, that's a different world you get into. and you got to have a little more knowledge than I had back then. But I had a great start in my ministry. I had older preachers helping me, going with me, being with me, and giving me advice. And finally, my church gave me an official license to go out and preach, letting people know that I was officially endorsed by the church and backed by the church. It took me a while to get that. Because my pastor, when I asked him, when do you think you might license me so they'll know the church is behind me when I go out in these places? He said, I don't know. We're putting a roof on the church this Saturday. Show up and help us with that. So a week or two later, I asked him again, have you thought any more about that license? He said, yeah, a little bit, thought a little bit about it, but both commodes are broken, and we're going to be changing them out on Saturday. Show up and do that. Help us with that, okay? Next thing I knew, I was mowing the grass. Next thing I knew, I was doing mechanic work on his car. And he kept avoiding the issue. And finally, I quit asking him. And one day he came and he said, son, if you wouldn't have helped with that roof, if you wouldn't have helped with them commodes, if you wouldn't have mowed the grass, if you wouldn't have worked on my car, I'd have never give you a license. He said, if you're not willing to do those tasks, you're not ready to be a preacher. You can't be trusted with people if you can't be faithful in those what they call menial tasks. Because he said, you're going to have a lot of them in the ministry. And he said, all that was a test, and you passed the test. And we'll be giving you a license this coming Sunday. So anyhow, he put me through the mill, but I looked back on it and thought, what a wonderful experience to go through that kind of test. I pastored 5 years in Statesville after 5 years at Piedmont Bible College in Winston-Salem. And had a good pastorate there, but God gave me a burden for the American Indian. I was already working with some of the Cherokees, but we were going to Canada and helping a preacher up there to move into a reservation. And I thought that's where I was going as a missionary. But I went to Cherokee and stayed for a summer, my wife and Brad and I. And Brad was a teenager then, still in school, of course. And while we were there in a camper that summer, two little old ladies came to us. And they said, we're so thankful God sent you to work with our kids. And I said, well, we're just here temporary. We're just staying in the camper. We're going to probably be going to Canada next year. And they said, no, you won't be going to Canada because God has told us you've come here to work with our kids. And those two grandmothers said, we've got 40 grandchildren. She's got 22, I got 18. And nobody's working with our kids here. And said, we'll find you a house if you'll come. I said, okay, you find me a house. And I kind of agreed because there were no homes available anywhere. There was 2 or 3 families living together back in 1980, and there was no extra houses. So, yeah, you find me a house and I'll come, because I knew that would sort of take a miracle. Well, a week later they called and said, we got you a house. And my wife said, oh, no, you should have never said that. It'll be a barn. It'll be a storage shed. It's hard telling what it is. I said, well, I gave my word, and we're going to move up there. And I'll go up and take a look at it and see what it is. I went up there, and this young couple, he had lost his job, and him and his dad were going to move out west and do some surveying and for about a year and a half. And they were going to let me live in his house. They get tribal permission. I pay his house payment. The house was 6 months old, 3-bedroom, brand new, brick home that had been built with government subsidy, and the whopping amount of his payment was $30 a month. Well, that was easy. I already had $100 support that a church was saving for me every month. So when we got ready to move, that church helped us move. They'd saved up about $1,500 to give us a little start. And boy, how exciting it was. It was in the tough neighborhood. It was pretty wild up there. Only one paved road in that whole community. But those kids, the first time we had a youth meeting, we had 50 kids at the church. Kind of filled the church up. Had more kids than they had on Sunday in adults. But all those kids, they had very little else to do, to be honest. But boy, we picked them up. Parents brought them. we met with them every Monday night in the youth meeting, and we built eventually a camp ministry from that original nucleus of kids. And it was so exciting and so wonderful. I worked primarily with the young people the whole time I've been there, but I have pastored 3 of the Indian churches, mainly so that I'd have a place to bring the kids when they were saved at church or Bible school or something. I could bring them to our church if they had nowhere else to go. So that gave us an anchor, and we built our ministry around that. And the first convert we had was 12 years old. A little girl, real shy, slow learner, behind a year or 2 in school. Her name was Tammy, or T.J. Bradley. And T.J. is still in our home church in Cherokee. She's about 50 years old now. And she's in charge of the youth work in our home church. And so I get to see the fruit of my ministry sitting in the church all the time when I'm pastoring or when I'm visiting or when I'm filling in for our pastor. And she, when she got saved at age 12, she eventually, in about 5 years, she won every member of her household to Christ, starting with her dad. She'd go in her room and cry and pray at night, and he could hear her. And after a few months of that, he called me and another preacher at 3 a.m. He wanted to make sure he got a He said, "I'm dying and going to hell, and I got to get saved tonight. Can y'all come?" I said, "I'll be there." And the other preacher both showed up. And the other preacher was TJ's pastor. He cried. He said, "I couldn't stand it anymore." He said, "I've been listening to my little girl praying for me and asking God to save me and take away my alcoholism." He said, "I can't stand it anymore." He said, "I got to get saved." Boy, he fell on his knees that night, got saved. Within about a year, he was serving as deacon in the church there. And the mother then was saved right after that. Then there was 2 brothers that got saved. And then there was an adopted one that got saved. And so they're all in our church now. The father died of cancer a few years ago. But that's part of the ministry in Cherokee. I'll jump a little bit ahead. In the year 2000, I made the trip to the Philippines. And when I got there, I kind of fell in love with those going back in the remote areas. I didn't care for the cities. They had churches in the cities. They had some thriving churches, but there was neglected places in northern Luzon where hardly anybody ever been. I went to a few places where the kids had never seen a white man. And there was one time that went into a village, and the kids were so amazed. There was this big white giant come into our village. And I had a short sleeve shirt. My hair was kind of dark back then on my arms. And 20 kids lined up just to come by and rub the hair on my arm, because they'd never seen that before. All those men over there had no hair. They almost never shave. Victor can use a razor I give him. He took my used razors with him. He said they'd last him a month or 2, maybe 6 months. And so those kids were just so excited to see this big white giant come in. So everywhere we went, we had youth ministry, and it was such a joy. I come back and told the Cherokees about it, and I was honest. I said, I may have to just start doing this full time. They said, okay, if you want to do that, you can be our liaison between the Cherokee and the Filipinos. You make the trips over there once or twice a year. And some of them help finance the trips. And I'd go over there and see what's going on, make a report, show how the money was used, get pictures and bring back, verify that the money we sent for a project was used for that project. And so I did that for about 20 years and have really enjoyed that. And I miss seeing the kids over there. We have had, after we built the Bible college, I think the last count, there's about 80 churches or missions that have been started out of that original Bible college back in 2002. In other words, they graduate, they go out and start a work. Almost all of them go out and start a new work in a new village. And then as young men are saved, and trained, they send them to another village 10 miles away. And so that's how 80 churches can be started in a reasonably short period of time. Well, 20 years, that's still a pretty short period of time to start a college and then have that many churches and missions. And so it's been a great, great ministry, and I used to be able to go and preach to 700 to 1,000 in a conference meeting somewhere. It was hard to find a building, so we would rent a gymnasium, an outdoor gymnasium. We could seat them all in there. And just had some great experiences. I miss going back there, but with my health, I really didn't want to risk a 40-hour trip. And maybe I lose my life, and then who's going to be there for Brad? I don't want to just neglect Brad by neglecting myself. So the doctors have told me, said, take care of yourself so you can take care of Brad. One doctor said, you know the reason I give you an appointment anytime you call is because of Brad, not because of you. Said, I want to keep you patched up so you can take care of my boy. And he's the orthopedic surgeon that put that big plate and repaired Brad's hip. He said it'll last 5 years, and it's been 20 years. And he's shocked. He said, I can't believe he's still able to use that left leg. Just don't let him stand on it. Don't let him put his weight on it, but he can use it to balance. But he's the doctor's pet. And I made the mistake last year of making an appointment with him, and I went and didn't take Brad. And he comes in, he says, well, where's Brad? And I said, well, I left him home with the caregiver. He said, well, I wouldn't have given you the appointment if I'd known you wasn't going to bring Brad. He said, now you get Brad in here at the next appointment. We'll have a follow-up in a couple of weeks, he said. And you bring Brad with you at the follow-up. So anyhow, that's how attached doctors and him and I don't know what happened to the doc, but he wouldn't talk about God years ago. And now him and Brad sit there and talk about the Lord for 20 minutes. And I say, whoa, wait a minute. I'm the patient. I'm here with the problem. And the doc will say, okay, let me take care of your dad, and then we'll get back to talking. And he'll take a half an hour and spend with Brad at these appointments. But that's the kind of impact that God has used Brad for. This doctors, nurses, they're by the dozens, maybe by the hundreds through the years. They know Brad in every hospital. And they'll say, who are you? And I'm Brad's dad. And it's what is who I'm known as. But it's been a great ministry. I'm sorry we've only got 3 or 4 minutes left, but do you have a question? Did I cover it that well or just confuse you so much you thought, wow. And I've got hundreds of stories I can tell, similar to that doctor. But it's just been a blessed time in our ministry. When the high blood pressure strokes came in 2017, it was pretty rough. My pressure went to 230 over 130 and stayed there for hours, and they couldn't even get it down. Went numb on the right side. They really thought I was going to die. And so they changed the medication. They gave me something new, and it worked and brought it down. So we finally realized the medicine I was taking was what was causing the blood pressure to go up. That and the stress I was going through, taking care of Brad and pastoring and doing the Philippine work and looking after the funds there. It was way too much, and I shouldn't have been trying to do that. Kind of cheated Brad, you know, by doing too much when I could have been doing more with him. Anyway, after the 2 blood pressures, they told me, said, you may have a big stroke within 2 years or a heart attack because the plaque in your body's loose now from the high blood pressure. The plaque breaks, and it's loose, and it might break loose and go to your heart or your brain, and it could be fatal. So I lived with that for 2 years, and finally, at the end of 2 years, I had the heart attack. And they were able to unplug, but it was 2 hours that I had a 98% blockage, and there wasn't enough blood going through to keep the muscle alive. My muscle at the very bottom of the heart's dead. It's not moving. but I've got enough right above the deadness to where it's pumping to get the blood circulated. But otherwise, I'm doing pretty good. When I go back, I've got to get a biopsy for prostate cancer. They think they found growths in my prostate, and they think it's cancer. So I got to get that checked when I get back. And it's always one thing after another, isn't it? Somebody said you have to be tough to grow old. Is that? Would y'all kind of agree with that? Those of you who know. All right. Thanks for giving me your attention. I appreciate it. I might repeat a little of this somewhere in a sermon or something. Because folks were asking me all kind of questions a little while ago. And if I don't repeat it, what I'll do is answer the questions quickly right after church, okay? If you have anything then. I'll stand back there somewhere and you can come and talk then. You want to just leave those pictures out there for now? Are there going to be others coming in? Okay. We'll just leave those pictures. You got them all? Okay. It don't matter. But we'll pass them out to some of the other people in a little while if you want to. That'd be okay? Thank you, Pastor.